He thought humiliating her would be easy, just another quick case to rush through before lunch. But Judge Richard Callahan had no idea he was about to lose control of his own courtroom. The kind of mistake that doesn't just echo for seconds but lingers for years. The kind that turns confidence into silence without warning. The courtroom that morning was polished and cold. Sunlight stretching across the dark would like it belonged there more than the people did. Lawyers in tailored suits shuffled. Papers with quiet urgency. Their voices low, controlled, practiced. Everything about the room spoke of order and power. And at the center of it all sat Callahan. His robe perfectly pressed. His posture relaxed in the kind of authority that comes from never being questioned. His gavel resting loosely in his hand like a symbol he didn't even need anymore. Then the doors opened, and Angela Brooks stepped in. And everything about her seemed to belong to a different world. Her sneakers worn from long days on concrete sidewalks. Her jacket simple and slightly faded. Her hands steady but marked by years of honest work. She carried no briefcase, no polished confidence. Just a small plastic folder held carefully against her chest. And in a room built on appearances, that was enough for people to decide who she was. A few heads turned. A whisper slipped across the benches. Someone in the back let out a quiet chuckle. And Callahan noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. His eyes scanned her. Once, slowly, deliberately, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Not enough to be called a smile, but enough to signal what he thought of her. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper. You're representing yourself today? The question hung in the air like a setup, and a few lawyers exchanged glances, already anticipating what was coming next. Angela nodded, her voice calm. Almost too calm for someone standing alone in a place like this. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly, and for a moment, just a moment, there was something in her tone that didn't match her appearance, something steady, something controlled, but it passed too quickly for anyone to question. Callahan leaned back slightly, tapping the gavel once against the desk, the sound echoing just enough to draw attention. Well, he continued, his voice now carrying across the room, this should be efficient. A few muted laughs followed, subtle but intentional, the kind of laughter that doesn't need volume to humiliate. And just like that, the courtroom shifted, not into chaos, but into something quieter, something sharper, the kind of tension that builds when one person is clearly being underestimated, and another is about to find out exactly what that costs. Angela didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and for the first time that morning, something almost imperceptible flickered across the room. Not doubt, not yet, but the faintest hint that this case might not unfold the way everyone expected. And Judge Callahan, still smiling, still confident, still certain he controlled every word spoken in that room, had already taken the first step into a moment he wouldn't be able to stop. The air in the courtroom shifted in a way most people could not explain, but everyone could feel. It was subtle at first, like the pause before a storm that no one had predicted. Judge Callahan leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping against the polished wood as he flipped through the thin file in front of him. The kind of file that usually meant a routine case, a minor violation, something that could be dismissed or decided in less than 10 minutes. Street vending without proper authorization. He read aloud, his tone flat but laced with quiet judgment. Operating outside designated city zones. He continued, glancing up at Angela with a look that suggested he had already made up his mind. Do you understand the charges against you, Ms. Brooks? Angela nodded once, her voice steady and measured. Yes, Your Honor, I do. There was no hesitation, no nervous stumble, just clarity, and for a brief moment, it created a small crack in the rhythm Callahan had expected, but he ignored it, choosing instead to press forward. Good, he said, leaning back again. Then let us not waste the court's time. A few people in the gallery shifted, sensing the direction this was going. The clerk adjusted her glasses, her pen hovering above the page as if waiting for something more than routine to happen. Callahan tilted his head slightly, his voice now louder, more performative. You were given citations on 3 separate occasions, he said, each word deliberate. And yet you continued to operate your stand as if the law did not apply to you. A pause followed, not for effect, but for control. Is there a reason you believe you are exempt? The question landed like a challenge, and a faint murmur rippled through the room. Angela did not immediately answer. She simply adjusted her grip on the folder in her hands, her fingers steady despite the weight of every eye in the room settling on her. The silence stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable, and Callahan smiled again, that same thin, dismissive smile. "Take your time," he added, though his tone made it clear he expected very little. Angela finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I was not operating illegally," she said, and the room reacted instantly. A quiet scoff from somewhere in the back, a lawyer shaking his head almost reflexively. Callahan let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that echoed just enough to reinforce the imbalance of power. "Not illegally," he repeated, as if testing the absurdity of the phrase. "Ms. Brooks, the city code is not open to interpretation by street vendors." More soft laughter followed, but Angela did not react. Her eyes remained steady, focused not on the crowd, not even on the judge, but somewhere just beyond, as if she was measuring something no one else could see. Callahan's expression hardened slightly, the amusement fading into impatience. "If you intend to argue," he said, tapping the gavel lightly against the desk, "I suggest you do so with facts, not opinions." The pressure in the room tightened, the kind that builds when someone is being cornered publicly, but Angela did not step back, did not lower her voice. Instead, she took a small breath, the kind that signals not fear, but decision, and in that moment, though no one said it out loud, something shifted again, because the woman they thought they understood had not yet begun to speak, and Judge Callahan, still convinced he was in control, had just pushed her one step closer to doing exactly that. The tension did not break. It tightened, like a string pulled just a little too far, and everyone in that courtroom felt it even if they could not explain why. Judge Callahan leaned forward again, this time slower, more deliberate, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had just noticed something that did not fit his expectations. "Then enlighten the court," he said, his voice now carrying less amusement and more challenge. "Explain how 3 citations issued by city officers somehow do not apply to you." The room stilled, the earlier whispers fading into a focused silence. Angela did not rush. She did not fumble through papers or search for the right words. Instead, she carefully opened the plastic folder she had been holding, the motion simple but precise, and pulled out a single document. The paper slightly worn but neatly preserved. She placed it gently on the table in front of her without stepping closer, without asking permission, just enough for the clerk to notice. "Because I was operating under a valid temporary permit," she said, her voice even, not louder, but somehow clearer than before. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the reaction was not laughter, it was hesitation. The clerk leaned forward instinctively, her pen hovering again as her eyes flicked toward the document. Callahan's expression did not change immediately, but there was a pause, a fraction of a second where his confidence recalibrated. "A temporary permit," he repeated, slower now, as if testing the weight of it. "And yet you failed to present this to the issuing officers." His tone sharpened again. Searching for control, Angela shook her head slightly. "I did present it," she replied, and this time there was something different beneath her calm. Not defiance, not emotion, but certainty, the kind that does not need reinforcement. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery again, not mocking this time, but curious. Callahan tapped the gavel once, a little harder than before, the sound cutting through the room. "Ms. Brooks, this is a court of law, not a place for convenient claims after the fact," he said, his voice firm. But the edge of performance had thinned. The clerk finally reached for the document, her fingers careful as she examined the seal at the bottom, her eyes narrowing as she traced the printed authorization. And in that moment, something subtle shifted again. The kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that follows. Callahan noticed it. Of course he did. His gaze flicked toward the clerk, then back to Angela, measuring, recalculating, but still unwilling to concede ground. Even if such a permit existed, he continued, pressing forward, it would not excuse repeated violations outside designated zones. He leaned back again, attempting to restore the balance he felt slipping. "You are not above regulations simply because you claim exception." Angela did not respond immediately. She let the silence settle again. Heavier now, more deliberate, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady. And then she spoke, not to argue, not to defend, but to clarify. The permit includes zone flexibility during designated hours, she said, each word measured, precise, as if she had repeated it before, as if she understood exactly how it would land. The clerk's pen lowered slowly to the paper, and the room, once again, began to quiet in a way that no one had expected. Because the woman they had dismissed was not just answering. She was building something, piece by piece, and Judge Callahan, still holding on to authority, had not yet realized he was no longer the one directing where this was going. The silence did not feel accidental anymore. It felt controlled, shaped, like something Angela had allowed to exist rather than something forced upon her. Judge Callahan straightened slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening around the gavel for just a brief moment before relaxing again. But that moment did not go unnoticed. The clerk's eyes remained fixed on the document, her posture more attentive now. Her earlier indifference replaced by a careful focus. Zone. Flexibility. Callahan repeated, slower than before, his voice measured, as if each word now required confirmation before being spoken. That would require explicit authorization, he added, leaning forward again, his tone attempting to reclaim certainty, but lacking the ease it once carried. Angela nodded once, not hurried, not defensive, just precise. It does, she said, her gaze steady. Section 12. Subsection B, paragraph 3. The specificity landed differently than anything she had said before. It was not an opinion, not an explanation. It was a reference, exact and deliberate, and the effect was immediate. The clerk lowered her pen completely and began scanning the document more carefully, her finger tracing the printed lines, her lips pressing together slightly as she verified what had just been said. A faint rustle moved through the gallery, not laughter this time, but shifting attention, the kind that signals something is changing. Callahan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicking once more toward the clerk, waiting, calculating, but unwilling to show hesitation openly. And yet, he said, pressing forward, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier confidence, you were cited multiple times by officers who presumably reviewed this same permit. He emphasized the word presumably as if it restored authority, as if it anchored the argument back in his control. Angela did not interrupt. She allowed the statement to settle, then responded with the same calm precision. They did not review it, she said, and this time, the words did not invite laughter or dismissal. They invited attention, the kind that fills a room without raising a single voice. Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest shift in his posture revealing that the narrative he had expected was no longer holding together as easily as before. That is a serious claim, he replied, his tone now more cautious than confrontational. The room felt smaller. Somehow, as if every sound had been pulled inward, the clerk finally looked up, her gaze moving from the document to the judge, a silent signal that something within those pages had aligned with what Angela was saying. And in that moment, the balance shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Angela remained still, her hands resting lightly, her shoulders relaxed, not because she was winning, but because she had never been playing the game the way they thought. And Judge Callahan, sitting at the center of authority, felt something unfamiliar press against his control, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. The kind that grows quietly until it demands to be acknowledged. He cleared his throat slightly, a subtle attempt to reset the rhythm. If what you are suggesting is accurate, he said, choosing each word carefully now, then this court will require more than verbal clarification. He gestured briefly toward the document. We will need to verify the validity and scope of this permit. Angela nodded again, as if she had expected nothing less, as if every step unfolding was already accounted for. And the room, once so certain of its outcome, now waited, not for the judge, but for what she would say next, because somewhere between the laughter and the silence, the simple story they thought they were watching had begun to unravel, and no one, not even Judge Callahan, could yet see where it would end. The weight of the moment settled deeper into the room, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but pressing steadily against every assumption that had been made just minutes before. Judge Callahan adjusted his posture again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if each movement now required thought instead of habit. His gaze returned to the document in the clerk's hands, then back to Angela, measuring her not by appearance anymore, but by something less visible and far more unsettling. Very well, he said, his voice controlled, though the earlier ease had faded. If this permit is as specific as you claim, then we will examine it properly. The words sounded procedural, routine even, but the tone beneath them carried a shift, subtle, but undeniable. The clerk cleared her throat softly, her eyes still scanning the text. Your Honor, she said, her voice careful. Section 12 does reference limited zone flexibility during designated hours, as stated. The confirmation landed quietly, but its impact spread instantly, a ripple of realization moving through the gallery. People leaned forward slightly, no longer passive observers, but witnesses to something turning. Callahan's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the bench, then released, his expression composed, but the silence around him felt different now. Heavier, less forgiving, limited flexibility. He repeated, as if narrowing the scope could restore control, which would still require compliance within defined parameters. Angela nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice calm. And I complied within those parameters. The certainty in her tone did not rise. It did not push. It simply existed, and that made it harder to dismiss. Callahan leaned forward again, his eyes sharpening slightly, searching for something, anything that could re-establish the imbalance he had relied on. Then explain, he said, his voice lower now, more focused than performative. Why enforcement officers issued citations on 3 separate occasions if you were fully compliant? The question hung in the air, not as a mockery this time, but as a test. The room held its breath in a way that felt deliberate, controlled. Angela did not rush to answer. She let the silence form again, thicker now, more intentional, her hands resting lightly as before, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady. Then she spoke, not louder, but clearer than ever. Because they did not read it, she said, and this time, the words did not echo with doubt. They settled with weight, the kind that demands attention. The clerk's pen remained still, her eyes lifting slowly from the document to Angela, then to the judge, as if confirming that what had just been said aligned with what she was seeing. Callahan's expression shifted, just slightly. The first visible crack in the confidence he had carried into the room, not disbelief, but realization beginning to take shape. He exhaled quietly, a controlled breath that carried more meaning than any words spoken so far. The courtroom, once filled with quiet amusement, now held a different kind of silence, one that no longer belonged to him alone. Angela remained still, composed, not pressing forward, not escalating, simply allowing the truth to stand where it had been placed. And in that moment, though no one announced it, though no gavel struck to confirm it, the balance had shifted again, and this time, it did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something that could not be easily undone. The silence no longer felt like hesitation. It felt like pressure building beneath the surface, the kind that does not explode immediately, but waits for the exact moment to break. Judge Callahan shifted slightly in his seat, his usual rhythm gone, replaced by something slower, more cautious. His eyes moved from Angela to the clerk again, then back, as if searching for a gap, a detail he could still control. Officers are trained to verify documentation, he said, his tone measured, but lacking the earlier certainty. It is unlikely that multiple citations would be issued without review. The statement sounded firm, but it landed differently now, no longer unquestioned, no longer accepted without thought. Angela did not react to the implication. She did not defend herself emotionally. She simply reached into her folder once more, her movements calm, precise, as if every step had already been decided long before she walked into that room. She pulled out a second set of papers, thinner, more structured, and placed them gently beside the first document. They did not verify it, she said, her voice steady, and I documented each interaction. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. The clerk leaned forward again, her attention sharpening further, her earlier neutrality now fully replaced by focus. Callahan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the shift small but undeniable. Documented. He repeated, slower this time, as if testing the implication before. Fully acknowledging it, Angela nodded once. Dates, times, badge numbers, and written responses, she clarified, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact. The room reacted again, but differently now. There was no laughter, no dismissal, only a subtle movement of attention, people leaning forward, listening more carefully than before. The clerk reached for the second set of papers, her fingers moving more deliberately now, her eyes scanning line by line, verifying, aligning, confirming. Callahan remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Angela, no longer assessing her appearance, but recalculating the situation unfolding in front of him. "And you are presenting this now," he said, his voice controlled, though quieter than before, rather than at the time of citation. Angela's response came without hesitation. "I attempted to," she said, her tone unchanged. But the officers declined to review the permit and proceeded with citation. The statement did not rise in volume, but it carried a clarity that cut through the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. The clerk paused, her pen hovering again, her eyes lifting slowly as she processed what she was reading, the alignment between Angela's words and the documentation in her hands becoming harder to ignore. Callahan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that signaled more than it revealed. His fingers tapped once against the bench, not in rhythm, but in thought. The courtroom, once guided entirely by his voice, now seemed to wait on something else, something quieter, something more precise. Angela remained still, composed, not pressing forward, not filling the silence, simply allowing it to exist, and in that space, the imbalance that had defined the room at the beginning was no longer intact. It had shifted, piece by piece, until the authority that once felt absolute now had to compete with something far less visible, but far more difficult to dismiss. And Judge Callahan, for the first time since the case began, was no longer speaking from certainty, but from a position he had not yet fully understood. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where one voice controlled the outcome. It felt like a space waiting to see who truly understood what was unfolding. Judge Callahan remained still for a moment longer than usual, his gaze fixed on the documents now in the clerk's hands, and for the first time, he did not immediately speak. That silence alone shifted the weight of the room. The clerk cleared her throat softly again, but this time it was not hesitation, it was preparation. "Your Honor," she said carefully, her voice steady but no longer neutral. "The documentation appears consistent across all entries. The dates match the citations, and the permit number aligns with the city registry format." The words were precise, professional, but their implication carried far beyond procedure. A subtle ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, not disruptive, but unmistakable. People were no longer watching a routine case. They were witnessing something turning. Callahan's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers resting flat against the bench now instead of tapping. A small change, but one that revealed the shift in his control. "Consistency does not necessarily confirm validity," he replied, his tone measured, attempting to regain structure, but the sharp edge from earlier had softened, replaced by something more careful. Angela nodded once, acknowledging the point. Without resistance, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. "That is correct," she said, her voice calm. "Which is why I also verified the permit directly with the issuing department." The statement landed with quiet force, the kind that does not demand attention but commands it anyway. The clerk's eyes lifted again, this time more quickly, as if anticipating what would come next. Callahan's gaze followed, narrowing slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus. "Verified," he repeated, slower, deliberate, as if each word now required confirmation before it could stand. Angela reached into her folder one more time, her movements unchanged, controlled, intentional. She pulled out a smaller sheet, more official in appearance, the seal at the top faint but visible even from a distance. She did not rush. She did not present it dramatically. She simply placed it beside the others, aligning it carefully. "Confirmation of validity and scope," she said, her voice steady. "Issued 48 Hours before the first citation, the room did not react immediately. The silence held, thick, deliberate, until the clerk leaned forward once more, her attention fully engaged now, her earlier neutrality completely gone, her pen resting motionless as her eyes scanned the new document, line by line, verifying, aligning, confirming. Callahan did not interrupt. He did not speak. He simply watched. And that was the moment everything shifted again, not because of what was said, but because of what was not. The authority that once filled every corner of the room now had to wait, had to observe, had to confirm. And that alone changed its nature. Angela remained still, her presence no longer defined by contrast, but by clarity. And as the clerk finally looked up, her expression more certain than before, the room understood something without anyone needing to say it out loud. This was no longer a simple case. This was a situation that had already been prepared, already been understood, and Judge Callahan, who had entered the room expecting control, was now standing at the edge of a realization he could not yet fully articulate, but could no longer ignore. The room had crossed a point no one had announced, but everyone could feel. The kind of invisible line where a situation stops being controlled and starts revealing itself. Judge Callahan remained still, his gaze no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but fixed with a quiet intensity that suggested something deeper was forming behind his composed expression. The clerk finally placed the last document flat against the desk, aligning it with the others, her movements slower now, deliberate, as if she understood the weight of what she was holding. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but carrying a new level of certainty. "The verification document confirms the permit was active, valid, and applicable within the cited time frames." The words settled into the courtroom like a final piece being placed into position, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. A subtle shift moved through the gallery. People no longer leaning forward out of curiosity, but out of realization. The narrative they had expected was no longer available. Callahan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried more than fatigue. It carried recalculation. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the bench, not tapping now, not performing. Simply grounded. "And the officers," he said after a pause, his voice quieter than before, more measured, "did not review this documentation at the time of citation." It was no longer a challenge. It was a question seeking confirmation. Angela nodded once, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "They declined to review it," she said, the repetition no longer defensive, but reinforcing. The clerk lowered her gaze briefly to the documents again, then back up, her silence acting as agreement. More powerful than words. The room held still, not waiting for noise, but waiting for resolution. Callahan leaned back slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, but structured, as if he was now holding himself within a framework he could not step outside of. "This court," he began, his tone formal, controlled, but lacking the earlier dominance, "relies on accurate enforcement and proper procedural review." The statement sounded official, but beneath it was something else, something closer to acknowledgement than authority. Angela did not respond. She did not interrupt. She allowed the words to exist without challenge, and that restraint shifted the dynamic further, because there was no resistance to push against, no argument to suppress, only facts that had already been placed. Callahan's gaze moved across the room briefly, then returned to her, and in that moment, the distance between them no longer felt defined by status, but by understanding. "If what has been presented is accurate," he continued, choosing each word with precision, "then the citations issued may not reflect a complete review of the applicable authorization." The phrasing was careful, deliberate, but the meaning beneath it was clear to everyone listening. The structure of the case had changed, not through confrontation, but through clarity. Angela remained still, her presence calm, grounded, not pressing forward, not claiming victory, simply standing in alignment with what had already been revealed. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now, more final, the courtroom understood something without needing it spoken directly. The authority that once shaped the room was no longer dictating the outcome. It was responding to it, and Judge Callahan, who had begun the morning with certainty, now stood at the edge of a realization that could not be reversed, because everything that mattered had already been said, and everything that followed would only confirm it. The courtroom did not return to its earlier state. It could not, because something fundamental had already shifted beneath the surface. Judge Callahan sat in stillness for a moment that stretched longer than any pause before, his gaze no longer scanning for control, but settling into something quieter, something more deliberate. The clerk remained poised, her hands resting lightly on the documents as if guarding their weight. The gallery was silent, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. The kind that comes when a moment begins to carry consequences beyond itself. Callahan finally spoke, his voice measured, but different now, stripped of performance. "Ms. Brooks," he said, and for the first time, her name did not sound like a formality, it sounded like recognition. "You have presented documentation that suggests procedural oversight." The phrasing was careful, but it did not diminish what had been revealed. Angela met his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. She did not nod. She did not react outwardly. She simply listened, allowing the words to stand on their own. Callahan continued, his tone steady, but no longer elevated above the room. "This court must consider whether the citations issued were based on a complete and accurate review of your authorization." The statement was no longer a defense of the system. It was an examination of it, and that distinction settled deeply into the space around him. A quiet shift moved through the gallery, not visible, not audible, but present, the kind that changes how people hold themselves, how they listen, how they understand what is unfolding. Angela remained still, composed, her presence no longer defined by contrast, but by clarity. Callahan's fingers rested flat against the bench, no movement, no tapping, just stillness. "Before I proceed," he said, his voice lower now, more grounded, "is there anything further you wish to present?" The question carried a different weight than anything he had asked before. It was no longer a challenge. It was an opening, the kind that acknowledges the possibility of something more. Angela did not answer immediately. She let the silence return, not as tension, but as space, her eyes steady, her breathing even. The room held with her, not waiting, but following. Then she spoke, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet precision that seemed to settle into every corner of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, and the words alone were enough to draw every bit of attention back to her, not because they were loud, but because of how they were delivered, without hesitation, without urgency, just certainty. Callahan did not interrupt. He did not move. He simply watched, and for the first time, the authority in the room was not leading the moment. It was listening to it. Angela's hands remained still against the table, her posture unchanged, but something in the air shifted again, something sharper, more defined, as if everything that had been building was now approaching a point of clarity that could not be avoided. The clerk's pen hovered once more, ready, not to record routine, but to capture something that mattered, and the courtroom, once guided by assumption, now stood on the edge of understanding that the case was not just about citations or permits. It was about something deeper, something that had not yet been spoken, but was already shaping what would come next. And Judge Callahan, who had begun the day certain of his role, now found himself in a position he had not anticipated, waiting, not to decide, but to hear what she would say next. The room did not move. It did not breathe. It simply held, as if every person inside understood that whatever came next would define everything that had happened before. Angela stood exactly where she had been, her hands still, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a weight that no one could ignore. Judge Callahan watched her closely, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with a kind of attention he had not given her before, the kind reserved for moments that cannot be undone. "Go ahead," he said quietly, his voice steady, but stripped of the edge it once carried. Angela nodded once, not as acknowledgement of power, but as recognition of the moment itself, and then she spoke, her voice calm, measured, but unmistakably precise. "I requested formal review," she said, each word landing clearly. Before the citations were finalized, the statement alone shifted the air again, subtle, but immediate. The clerk's pen lowered slightly, her eyes lifting as if anticipating something more. Callahan's expression remained composed, but his focus sharpened, Formal review. He repeated, slower now. The words no longer rhetorical. Angela continued without pause. And I filed that request through the city compliance office. She added, her tone steady, her gaze unwavering. The room leaned into the silence that followed, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. This was no longer about defense. This was about process, about structure, about something that extended beyond the courtroom itself. Callahan's fingers pressed lightly against the bench again, not tapping, not performing, simply grounded. And the result of that review? He asked, his voice controlled, but quieter than before. Angela did not answer immediately. She reached into her folder once more, her movements unchanged, precise, intentional. She withdrew a final document, thinner than the others, but marked with an official header that caught the clerk's attention instantly. Angela placed it carefully beside the rest, aligning it without urgency, without emphasis, as if the act itself did not require explanation. It was approved, she said, and this time, the words did not echo. They settled, firm, final. The clerk leaned forward again, her focus absolute, her eyes scanning the page, verifying the seal, the signature, the date, the alignment with everything that had been presented before. Callahan did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply watched, and that silence carried more weight than any command he had given earlier. The courtroom held still, not waiting for reaction, but absorbing the shift, because it was no longer gradual. It was complete. The structure that had supported the case at the beginning had been replaced entirely, not by argument, but by clarity. Angela remained still, composed, her presence unchanged, not pressing forward, not seeking recognition, simply allowing what had been established to stand on its own. And in that moment, the balance that had once defined the room no longer existed. It had been replaced by something quieter, something more precise, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. And Judge Callahan, who had once directed every word in the room, now found himself in a position he had not anticipated, not as the one who controlled the outcome, but as the one who had to acknowledge it. And as the silence deepened, heavier now, more final than anything before, the realization settled across the courtroom without a single word needing to confirm it. Everything that mattered had already been said, and what came next would not change that. It would only reveal how far the truth had already gone. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the room with a finality that no one could escape. Judge Callahan remained still, his eyes fixed on the last document now resting among the others, the weight of it no longer in question. The clerk's posture had changed entirely, her earlier neutrality replaced by quiet certainty. As she finished reviewing the page, her pen no longer hovering, but resting, as if there was nothing left to confirm. The gallery sat motionless, not out of tension now, but out of understanding, the kind that arrives when the outcome has already revealed itself before it is spoken. Callahan inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate, but carrying something heavier beneath it, something closer to acknowledgement than authority. The record, he began, his voice steady, but no longer elevated above the room, indicates that a valid permit was issued, verified, and applicable during the time in question. Each word landed with precision, not as a declaration of power, but as a statement of fact. Angela stood as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged, not reacting, not shifting, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. Callahan continued, his gaze lifting briefly before returning to the documents. Furthermore, he said, choosing each word carefully, it appears that a formal compliance review was requested and approved prior to enforcement action. The phrasing was controlled, but the implication beneath it was unmistakable. The structure of the case had not just weakened, it had collapsed. The clerk gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her agreement silent but clear. The room remained still, no whispers, no movement, just a shared awareness that something significant had just been established. Callahan's fingers rested flat against the bench, unmoving, his earlier rhythm gone completely, replaced by stillness that spoke louder than any gavel strike. Given these findings, he said, his tone formal, but grounded in something different now, something more accountable. The citations issued do not reflect a complete or accurate application of the governing regulations. The words did not echo, they settled, final, the kind of finality that does not require repetition. Angela did not move, did not respond. She simply stood, her eyes steady, her expression calm, as if this outcome had never been uncertain to her, as if every step that had led to this moment had already been understood. Callahan paused again, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but necessary, a space where the weight of what had just been said could exist fully. And then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifted back to Angela, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no assumption, no dismissal, only recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what is already unfolded. The courtroom held that moment, quiet, unmoving, and in that stillness, it became clear that what had begun as a simple case had become something else entirely, something that had exposed not just a mistake, but a pattern, not just an error, but a failure to see what had been in front of them all along. And Judge Callahan, who had once shaped the narrative of the room, now stood within it, no longer above it, no longer directing it, but part of it, bound to the same truth that had been placed, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to question. And as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, it carried with it the unmistakable sense that this moment would not end with a ruling. It would leave something behind, something that could not be undone. The silence did not break even after the words had been spoken. It lingered, heavier now, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with the weight of what had just been acknowledged. Judge Callahan remained still, his posture no longer defined by authority, but by responsibility, the kind that cannot be set aside once it has been recognized. His gaze moved slowly from the documents to Angela, and in that movement, something shifted again, not in power, but in perspective. This court, he said, his voice steady, measured, but no longer distant, cannot uphold citations that were issued without full procedural review. The words were formal, but the meaning beneath them was clear, unmistakable, final. The clerk straightened slightly, her pen lifting once more, but this time not in hesitation, in confirmation, ready to record what had already become inevitable. The gallery remained silent, not because they were waiting, but because they understood the outcome was no longer unfolding. It had arrived. Angela stood as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, her presence unchanged, not reacting to the shift, not claiming it, simply standing within it. Callahan continued, his tone grounded, each word placed carefully. The citations against Ms. Brooks are hereby dismissed. The sentence settled into the room without echo, without resistance, just finality, the kind that does not need reinforcement. The clerk's pen moved across the page, recording the ruling with steady precision, the small sound of ink against paper the only movement breaking the stillness. But Callahan did not stop there. He did not move on. He did not close the case as quickly as he could have. Instead, he paused, and that pause carried more meaning than the ruling itself, because it was not required, it was chosen. His eyes returned to Angela, not as a formality, not as procedure, but as acknowledgement. This court also recognizes, he said, his voice quieter now, but clearer, that enforcement must reflect both the letter and the application of the law. The statement was careful, but it reached further than the case itself. It extended beyond the documents, beyond the citations, into something broader, something that had been revealed through the process. Angela did not respond. She did not interrupt. She allowed the words to exist, just as she had allowed everything else. Without resistance, without need, the room remained still, absorbing what had been said, not as instruction, but as understanding. Callahan's fingers rested lightly against the bench, no movement, no gesture, just stillness. And in that stillness, the difference between power and responsibility became clear, because one can be taken for granted, and the other cannot. The courtroom, once shaped by assumption, now held something else entirely, something quieter, something more grounded, something that did not rely on appearance or expectation, but on clarity. Angela remained where she was, her posture steady, her expression calm, not elevated by the outcome, not defined by it, simply present within it. And as the silence settled one final time, deeper than before, it carried with it a realization that no one in the room could ignore. What had happened here was not just a dismissal. It was a correction, not just of a case, but of something more fundamental, something that had been overlooked until it could no longer be. And Judge Callahan, who had once believed he understood the room completely, now sat within it differently, not above it, not apart from it, but within it, bound by the same clarity that had brought everything to this moment. No one moved immediately after the ruling, not because they were uncertain, but because something in the room had shifted beyond the case itself. Angela remained standing for a moment, her hands still resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if the outcome had not altered her in any visible way, and in truth, it had not, because she had never entered the room to win, she had entered it to be heard. And now that she had been, there was nothing more to add. Judge Callahan watched her quietly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer measured for effect, but thoughtful in a way that suggested the moment had extended beyond his expectations. The clerk finished recording the final notes, her pen slowing before coming to a complete stop, the small sound fading into the larger silence that had settled across the courtroom. Angela gathered her documents carefully, not hurried, not deliberate for attention, just precise, the same way she had handled every step since she arrived. And as she placed the final paper into her folder, she paused, just for a moment, not to speak, not to challenge, but to acknowledge the space itself. Then she looked up, her eyes steady, meeting the judge's gaze without tension, without resistance. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, not apology, not explanation, but recognition, the kind that arrives when assumptions fall away and clarity takes their place. Callahan gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what had already been understood. Angela turned without urgency, her steps measured as she walked toward the courtroom doors, the same doors she had entered through under a very different weight. The gallery watched her, not with curiosity now, but with respect that had formed quietly, without announcement, the kind that does not need to be expressed to be felt. As she reached the exit, the sunlight beyond the doors stretched across the floor again, unchanged, steady, waiting, and as she stepped through it, she did not look back, not because she needed to, but because there was nothing left behind that required it. The doors closed softly, the sound barely audible, yet it carried a finality that settled deeper than any ruling. Judge Callahan remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the empty space where she had stood, the weight of the morning still present, not as pressure, but as understanding. Something had shifted within that room, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, and though the case had ended, the impact of it had not, because what had been revealed was not just a correction of error, but a reminder, quiet and undeniable, that authority is not proven by control, but by the willingness to recognize when it is wrong. And in that stillness, as the courtroom slowly began to move again, papers gathered, chairs shifted, voices returned in low murmurs, the echo of that moment remained, not in sound, but in memory, and somewhere beyond the walls of that room, life continued as it always did, sidewalks filled, conversations resumed, the ordinary world moving forward. But within those who had witnessed it, something stayed, something simple, something clear, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the room had remembered what dignity looks like.